Hi, I'm Nichole Argo, the director of the TogetherUp Institute. The mission of the TogetherUp Institute is to build a national movement for connecting across differences in our lives and our communities. And we are here today for a podcast called Reimagining Us. The purpose of Reimagining Us is to bring the stories and skills and ideas for making change, productive change in our lives and communities amidst a time of division.
And I'm Scott Hutchison, Executive Director of E Pluribus Unum, or EPU. EPU is a nonprofit that works across the South, based in New Orleans, to advance equity and to look at barriers that keep racism, systemic racism, in place across the South and across our country. I'm really happy to be here with you today and throughout this whole podcast, Nichole.
Likewise, Scott.
So, with the podcast, who are we talking to? What do we hope we bring to the table?
Our goal is to reach everyday Americans, people who are sitting in their lives and communities, maybe feeling exhausted by the divisions, unsure of how to make change, but knowing they want something better. We're reaching them by providing the stories of where is that happening? How can we do it? What are the mindsets, the skill sets, the inspirations that can help us make these changes in our lives?
And hearing personal stories and journeys and finding a way for people to get involved in their own communities and their own lives. That's going to be very exciting.
We are breaking this into two main segments. So for the first 3 episodes, we're really honing in on what are the divisions? What does us versus them look like in our lives? How do we identify it and then change it? And for the final 4 episodes, we're going to focus on how do we bring belonging into our conversations, into our communities? How do we listen better, become more curious, learn to de-escalate when a conflict appears to be taking hold in a non-productive manner? And then who's doing that, to your point? Where are stories of individuals who are successfully changing the ways that they approach their lives or their relationships or their communities? And what does that mean for us? Where can we find the resources and the practice to do the same?
I want to have a moment of broadcast honesty. We are actually recording this episode 4 days before the presidential election. And we're talking about the election because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter personally in the polarization piece is still going to be there regardless of who wins on Tuesday. And I think that becomes an important moment in the sense of, or an important point about this podcast.
Whenever there's a big presidential election in this country, a significant number in the population, right, feels let down, maybe feels disheartened. This election is bigger than, anything in the history, in my life that I can remember, right? Where the stakes feel so high to so many people. So we know that there will be some who are hopeful and want to forge a path forward. And I think this podcast, which is focusing on the bigger we and reminding them that we need to do it all together. We have to bring everyone to the table to envision what we want together, to find the common values, the shared interests, the paths that we can build together is important. But I think maybe even more importantly, for those whose candidate did not win, who are worried about the direction of this country or being left behind, they need to remember that they have a part in this process too. And they need to see the others reaching out to them and saying, come help, let's do this together. I think that what we do now as a nation and in our local communities and our own local lives, how we extend our hand and invite others in to co-create our future and our governance structures is the most important thing for our next decades in this democracy.
Divisions are divisions. Sometimes they're wrapped in something different, like an election. Sometimes they're wrapped in a religion. Sometimes they're wrapped around who you love. But the idea is that what we hope to accomplish with Reimagining Us kind of rises above all of that and gives you tools to be human, to be compassionate, to be who you believe you are and who you know you are inside.
Throughout decades, the United States has always known polarization. People have always had different ideas, and frankly, it's a great thing. It's how we sharpen our thoughts and become innovative and become better for a collective, right? By debating, by considering other perspectives. But what we see with toxic polarization today is fundamentally categorically different. Right now, there's something called affective polarization, which means it's not that your ideas are different than me or mine are different than you. It's that I dislike you because you're a member of the other group and you dislike me. I don't even think about what your ideas are, and frankly, I may not even really know them or understand them. It's just that you're different and I don't feel good about it, right? I don't like you. The other thing that we see with this moment of toxic polarization is perceptions, misperceptions. So a recent study by Beyond Conflict showed that Americans incorrectly believe that members of the other party dehumanize, dislike, and disagree with them about twice as much as they actually do. So here we are sitting, not even just feeling dislike for each other, but not really even understanding who each other is. Our perceptions are completely off base. And this exists as a chronic state of polarization where we have high levels of loyalty to our own groups and dislike or even hate for the other.
But one thing that listeners will figure out about this podcast is that you're the scientist and I'm the one that's here to learn. And so I have questions about what you just said. So you talk about affective polarization. You gave us a definition of what that is, and perceived polarization. But aren't we polarized? I mean, isn't it real? In a way, I hear perceive and I hear, affective, but there is a real divide and it's created, right? And part of what we want to explore with Reimagining Us is the idea of how do I separate those two things? And what becomes real for me is what I feel as a human, my moral compass leads me to believe. And, some of the data that E Pluribus Unum has looked at is the idea that there's a lot of conflict even within our own belief system, what I believe I can do versus what I'm actually doing. And all of that in the middle that stops me from doing that is exactly what this podcast is about and exploring. So, tell us more about what does polarization do? I mean, what is it? How does it affect me every day? How does it affect my community? Because that's an important thing, because I don't know what those polarization is. I can't touch it, but I can see it and feel it in my community. So tell us more about that.
I think that's the biggest thing, is that polarization is not just politics. 87% of Americans say they dislike the divisions in our country. They're exhausted by the politics and they want to disengage. They just want to leave it at the front door. But the unfortunate truth for all of us is that it becomes personal. Because if I'm afraid that what I think or what I might say, if I'm afraid that using my voice will cause harm to me, that I'll be canceled or attacked or that people near me will, then I'm afraid to use my voice.
But that's real.
That's real.
That fear is real. And
it affects behavior.
That's right. And we know that. We do it. We edit ourselves all the time. And, as a Southerner, there's nothing wrong with editing yourself sometimes. But the point is when you can't show up as yourself and really express beliefs and feel safe, you have problems, and the problems trickle through your family, through your community. And that is also something that we're seeing, though, I really hear you and understand the idea that, politics is like the almost most stark example of that polarization. But the idea that we are more than that. We are more than our party, because, those are in cycles. Elections are in cycles. Yeah. And so everything that we do in the middle leads us to the next cycle. And I think, what I hope to do as we explore that idea in this podcast is to understand, what can I do so that the next time or the next conversation helps me be more prepared, where I don't lose my cool, I don't say something I wish I hadn't said, and I don't create even a deeper division with somebody who is really close to me. Because oftentimes in politics, I'm never going to meet those people. I don't know, how they act when they're not in front of the camera or when they're not sitting behind their desk, but I do know how my neighbor acts, and I do know how I want my children to act, and my family and friends. And so it's much deeper than all of that, isn't it?
It's much, and it comes right down to our family dinners, right? Politics isn't politics anymore. Now it's identity. And so if I turn to my aunt or my nephew and I feel like I can't talk with them because I know they have different beliefs and I'm afraid of where it would go, I've actually just curtailed my family life, right? Or if I don't go to the school district meeting because I think there will be a fight or nobody will want to hear what I have to say, well, now I'm not a contributing member of my community into my kids' school life. And I think that this is the way that it has affected us personally. It has affected our communities. And it's really not something that we want for ourselves or our children. It's not being our best selves, right? And it doesn't allow our communities to thrive. But I want to pick up what you said is really important, that even if our perceptions are inaccurate, if they cause us to feel threat and fear, they're real. They transform into our behaviors and into our thoughts. And we're taking that seriously. How we feel is valid. But what I think is most important is understanding if those feelings are not based on a true and accurate assessment of who others are or what their beliefs or stances are or why they hold those beliefs and stances, if we lose track of the greater we and our humanity, then it's not serving us. And we need to step in and change that.
Well, I think that's exactly what we're going to do, I hope, with this podcast.
I'm right with you, Scott.
Nichole, what led us here? Who are you? Who am I? What got us here together?
Well, I can answer the first question about me, and I can't wait to hear what you're going to bring out for you. I'm a Midwesterner, and I have really strong Norwegian roots. I grew up with my great aunt, picture of King Olaf V on every wall in our house. But if you know anything about the Midwest or Norway, you'll see that I grew up steeped in an ethos of peacemaking and peace building, finding common ground, common sense, common ground, common good. We have a friend who likes to say that. As I grew older, I became a social psychologist. So as you know, I think all the time about how we think, feel, and behave in groups, and particularly when we're in conflict, when we feel threatened. And most of my life's work was, how do we transform those conflicts into places of cooperation? So I really came to my work on belonging through research on political violence, believe it or not. And my question was, how do we get to a place where it feels possible to hurt others or even sacrifice ourselves to do it? Unbelievably, that answer has everything to do with belonging, or an imbalance of it. So what I saw was that when we felt totally excluded or under attack by another group, and we also were fused, right? We love our group. We felt like our group matters. People need to acknowledge that and recognize it. And we would I've seen people who would do anything to make the other group acknowledge that, right? We matter. Even if they knew it wouldn't change the status quo. So something about our connection to each other, it seems to drive the most important decisions in our life. So the other thing that brought me to my work on belonging has been through studying resilience. And as a college student, like so many in the United States, I spent a fabulous year in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And in Zimbabwe, I was with a network of rural villages called ORAP, the Organization of Rural Associations for Progress, who had survived what would have been an epic famine, similar to the 1980s in Ethiopia. But they survived it because they worked together across tribe, men and women who hold very different traditional roles, all members of society. They said, listen, and we're not going to have water. It's going to be a huge drought. So what we're going to do is when one group has a surplus of food, they can share it with those groups that don't. and we'll be in constant communication, and this way we'll take care of everybody, whether you're the weakest member of society or the highest. And it worked. And so the UN asked them to build a program on grassroots resilience. How do we build resilient communities? Today in the United States, there's a figure that Amanda Ripley shares in her new book, which is that 90% of counties across the United States were designated as disaster areas, able to get funding from the federal government over a 10-year period up to 2020. Most of those disaster designations happened because of extreme weather, but it could have been other things as well. The takeaway for that is that in our country, we are facing a time of challenge even bigger than this toxic polarization, right? There's all sorts of things happening with climate, with societies, with pandemics, with economic change. We have to tackle it together, and we have to be resilient. But as long as we are in the throes of toxic polarization, we can't be. So most of my work in the recent years has focused on how do Americans experience belonging? What does that look like for them? How do we build it? Because we know it is the only way to counter the challenges that we're going to face in the future. Okay, that's me. Scott, what brings you here today?
Well, look, I am a lifelong Southerner. I was born in Georgia, raised in Texas and in Louisiana. I went to college in Louisiana at Louisiana Tech and studied political science. I got a master's degree in nonprofit administration. But how I got to this work was through a series of kind of remarkable events that started with Hurricane Katrina. And learning, how communities come together, how people support one another. And, in a lot of the study that E Pluribus Unum has done, we find what brings communities together, often in the South, are food, obviously, sports, obviously, music, culture, art, but then also tragedy.
Yeah.
And as you talked about that piece with Amanda Ripley, it made me wonder as I moved through my work at E Pluribus Unum and with the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, was why can't we be that way every day? I mean, that's crazy. We don't even think twice to help somebody. We don't think twice about what it is going to take to bring us back to where, not just where we were, but also where we should be. Yeah. What we could do at this point. So as you and I have talked over the years, the idea has just been so interesting to me because all those things you talked about, polarization, how people get there, what they want, is, to me, encapsulated in the South. We avoid difficult conversations my whole life. It's like I would rather not talk about that and move on. My mother, if she would just act like she didn't hear you, instead of get into some sort of conflict. But the minute somebody left, she would start telling me all the things she would wish she had said. And the way she, this woman's this or this man's that or our neighbor's this. So it's all under the surface. And so I'm like, well, if all of that being together in tragedy and in sports, sitting around a table is there, and all of that angst is also there, how do you make more of the good and less of the bad? I'm not a scientist. I don't know the right words to say about that, the scientific words to say about that, but I know the human words, and I know the way I felt and the way I grew up. So I wanted to have conversations and kind of demystify that for people who are just like me across the South and across the country.
I love that, and I'd never thought this before, but Midwesterners, Norwegians, and Southerners have something really important in common.
What's that?
They don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't going to be like smoked fish, but yes, absolutely. It is true. We avoid it, and when you're actively avoiding conflict, you have to see it around you. It's there. It infuses how you treat people and how you treat your family and what you're willing to hear and what you're not willing to hear. And I find that so fascinating. And I think the reason we brought together the best experts on this is to help us let our curiosity to be better at mitigating conflict and discussing it. You say something all the time to me. You go, bridging across differences isn't about creating solutions to problems. There is such things as good conflict. There are things that are part of who we are as humans that need to exist. Different points of view, different ideas. And, this podcast is all about making space for all of those things to live at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. Bridging across differences is not just about, I think it might be necessary, but not sufficient to solve problems. But being able to come to the table where we've been afraid to talk, where we've relied on our assumptions, and sometimes demonized or inaccurately perceived others because of that, that holds us all back, right?
Yeah.
And I think part of my learning as a human to grow out of what my great aunt might have taught me about what it means to be Norwegian and rock the boat is that it's okay actually to sit and say, tell me more about your different feelings and then bring us all honestly to the table, reconnect us.
Yeah. So Nichole, we talk about how polarization affects communities, how it affects the people in the communities. Talk a little bit about mattering and feeling valued, feeling belonging. Tell us a little bit about that and why it's important to combat.
Can I use some of the data that EPU has brought up for this?
Sure.
So in your survey of the South, you ask a randomly selected households throughout 13 states of the South how people are feeling, like, do they matter? Do they feel valued by their community? Do they feel that if they were to speak out and say something different from others, that it would be okay? And I think those statistics are really revealing. So some of what you learned is that around half of respondents don't feel like they matter or are valued in their local communities, and a majority are afraid of speaking out because if they did, they think that they would be punished or they fear what could happen. In a survey I did in 2022, a national survey called the Belonging Barometer, we found that around a third of Americans felt local level belonging, right? That means a majority of Americans across the country don't feel like they belong in their local communities.
How does that show up? What does that do to me as a person if I feel that way? Because am I conscious of it, or is it a consequence of something, right?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think people are perceiving that they'll be shut down or punished if they say something someone doesn't like, and they therefore censor themselves, right? So they're rethinking or double-checking their thoughts and holding them in. They're taking away their own freedom, in a sense.
But isn't it true? I mean, we've seen this over the past few years, especially cancel culture and all of that.
Absolutely.
So there's a reason that people feel that way. And so how do you work through that? I mean, how does this podcast help us work through that? Because it is real, but yet there's an opportunity for more.
We can design our lives, our communications, and our communities for belonging. And I think the answer is, if we are in a culture where we perceive that we will be punished, we'll act in a certain way. And if we learn to identify it and name it and change those dynamics, we can free everybody up. So we have the evidence is in. You are more innovative, creative, and productive when you're in a group with people who hold different perspectives than you, but only if everybody feels free to share their perspectives. So without that sense of belonging and freedom and being valued and valuing others, we can't thrive. It's really that simple.
And I think we've seen that. And I think for me, it's one of those, there's a contradiction in all of that, because while intellectually I understand and I appreciate that, I still have to overcome my upbringing. I have to overcome, in my case, my southernness to avoid that, because I don't want to be called out for those things. And so, I think when I think about what Reimagining Us is going to do, it's also going to create, you've said this phrase before, psychological safety. The idea that okay, this is not going to be the end of the world. I know it's going to be tough. I can practice. We'll talk later on about how our data shows people are willing to practice to be better at something and step into that space. And I can do it as deeply as I want. I can do it as intensely as I want. So we're looking to meet people where they are on this journey. This is not, okay, you've got to go through this program or you've got to do, something that makes you extraordinary. That's not what this is about. This is about listening to people talk and then seeing what you can apply in your life and then applying a little more, getting a little more courage or understanding, having a little more curiosity. I think it's interesting when we talked to a group of white women in the South about how they were fearful of saying something that might be against what their neighbor thought. We asked them, what do you wish they would bring to the table? I thought personally they would say, I wish they would just tolerate me and just be quiet and listen. That's not what they said at all. They said, I wish they would be curious and wonder and ask why I feel that way. And that one little turn of phrase really affected me. I thought, am I curious enough? Do I care? Or do I immediately go crazy or, the opposite of me kind of thing and just run away from them and put them in a bucket and never deal with them again? And so I think, what I see you teeing up so well with this podcast is the idea of find what fits for you. Listen to people and see what you can apply. And at the end of the day, we know, or we hope, you'll be better for it. You'll have new tools. You'll feel more secure. And you can get to a different place. And that place can also be your community.
The research you and I have done brought us to the realization that Americans throughout the country, in the South and everywhere, they want to connect across difference. They want to practice these skills. They want a productive, connecting, collaborative way forward. We're talking majorities. They feel like their leaders are not helping them to produce that, and they're not quite sure how to take the next step. And I think listeners might be interested to know that 6 months ago, maybe even 4 months ago, this podcast wasn't even a thing in our minds, right?
Yeah.
But we sit with these data and come out of these focus groups so heartened and hopeful by all these people in their own minds and lives saying, I really do want to understand others. I really want them to understand me. And we can't get past, the headline, the Twitter feed statement. And with all of this data showing that this is what Americans want, who's going to bring them the tools and the insights and the best thinkers and the guide sheets and the ways to practice? We view this podcast as a place of insight, of skill building, of resource awareness and connection. Because at the end of the day, it's through our connection that we're able to build.
And I think we see it as something that is approachable, that is applicable, and kind of demystifying words that we hear in ways that we feel.
My hope for Reimagining Us is that it can serve as a design for our lives and relationships, for our communities, and for the United States as a nation. My name is Nichole Argo.
And I'm Scott Hutchison. Thank you for being with us on Reimagining Us, and we'll see you on our next episode.
Reimagining Us is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow the show and give it a 5-star review if you'd be so kind. Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/reimaginingus and togetherup.org/reimaginingus.